Number 11. MV Irish Trader Shipwreck. Known for its empty beaches and rare wildlife, Louth is Ireland's smallest county. Located north of Dublin, its 56-mile coastline feels like an entirely separate world from the rest of the country and like a step back in time. In addition to hosting some of Ireland's most seldom seen species, Louth is home to a rapidly decaying shipwreck called the MV Irish Trader. The vessel was carrying over 450 tons of fertilizer from the English port of Sharpness to the Irish port city of Drogheda in 1974 when it encountered a brutal storm and ran aground. The exact circumstances of the wreck remain somewhat of a mystery to this day. For nearly 50 years now, what's left of the Irish Trader has sat deteriorating on the beach at Baltray, a small village consisting of just 132 residents. Its condition continues to worsen as returning storms batter the decrepit vessel, reducing it to little more than a rotting hunk of metal. Most of the ship is gone, and what little remains will soon be either buried or washed away. Writer Darren McLaughlin visited the wreck several times, capturing a series of photos that reveal its rapid demise. The last images he took in 2018 show a mangled, rusting heap that has become covered in moss as it sinks into the sand. Number 10. Dozens of dead whales. Located on the northern shore of New Zealand's South Island, Farewell Spit Beach is notorious for its whale strandings. In the latest incident, a pod of 36 pilot whales found themselves washed ashore. Rangers from the country's Department of Conservation scrambled alongside workers and volunteers from the wildlife charity project Jonah New Zealand to get as many of the whales back into the water as they could. Unfortunately, very few could be saved. By the time help arrived, only 5 of the animals were still alive. At least 31 whales died, including 2 of the 5 that had been returned to the water. Members of a local Maori organization representing the country's indigenous people came and blessed the carcasses, which were left in a cordoned-off part of the beach to decompose naturally. While the recent stranding was undoubtedly tragic, it was much smaller than some past incidents at Farewell Spit Beach. In 2017, an estimated 400 whales washed up on the shore. There have been at least 10 mass strandings at the beach over the last 15 years. What do you think causes these strandings? Share your theories below. Number 9. Gigantic pipes. 2017 proved to be an eventful year for England's Norfolk coast. Just months after $60 million worth of cocaine washed ashore, a dozen massive plastic pipe segments appeared on the beach. They were 8 feet in diameter, with the longest pipe measuring 1,574 feet long. The Titanic tubes were en route from Norway to Algeria when the ship that they were traveling on collided with a container ship. They became loose and fell into the water, and the waves carried them to dry land. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency reassured the public that the pipes did not pose any threats to public health or safety, but the Norwegian company that manufactured the stranded goods, Pipelife, advised people to keep their distance to avoid the possibility of being crushed. The statement came after social media users began posting photos of themselves standing on top of the pipes. Pipelife export manager Trygve Blomster told The Guardian that these tubes are especially dangerous near water, which can move them around without warning. Not only would it be extremely painful to fall off one of the pipes, it wouldn't take much for the waves to roll over a person. Thankfully, nobody was harmed and the mess was cleaned up with no damage done to the environment. Number 8. Byzantine Pillar. During routine patrol in the Israeli port city of Ashdod recently, 2 policemen discovered something protruding from the sand. They notified the proper authorities and archaeologists were sent to the scene, where they identified the object as a 1,500-year-old marble pillar. Thought to be part of a large Byzantine-era church located nearby, the buried artifact has been exposed by recent rains. The 5.2-long-foot pillar was in one piece, making it an especially rare find according to Avi Levy, an archaeologist with the Israel Antiquities Authority. He further explained that the marble was sourced from somewhere outside Israel and that further tests are needed to determine where it came from. The Byzantine church compound was part of an ancient city where excavations have been ongoing since 2013. Known as Ashdod Yam, it was one of the most important Israeli coastal cities of its time period, facilitating the trade of raw materials, food, and other products. In addition to the church, the settlement contained a fortress, several public buildings, and a main road. Number 7. Mysterious creature. Ian Kettle was walking his dog along a beach in Merseyside, England recently when he spotted what he initially thought was a dead dolphin. His miniature schnauzer Dylan had run off and started rolling around in something. When the pup refused to return to his owner, Ian went to retrieve him, which is when he passed by the 6-foot-long, partially decomposed creature. A nearby beachgoer told the man that they had also noticed the animal and had contacted the local environmental authorities. Others who had seen the carcass said that it had been there a while. Ian told reporters that he was surprised that the creature had ended up so far inland. But as it turned out, it wasn't as unusual as he thought. A spokesperson for Green Sefton, the agency tasked with upkeeping the Sefton shoreline, said that it wasn't uncommon for marine animals to appear in the area, especially during particularly high tides, which were happening around the time the remains were discovered. The representative added that the carcass was thought to be a dolphin of some type. Number 6. Lots of plastic tubing. Beachgoers in Cape Cod were baffled when large amounts of yellow plastic tubing began washing ashore last year. It continued to appear, but nobody knew what it was until Laura Ludwig, who manages the Center for Coastal Studies Marine Debris and Plastic Programs, identified it as shock tubing. The material was used to transmit an electrical charge to underwater explosives during a Boston Harbor dredging project that ran from last June until January. In a statement, the Army Corps of Engineers said that the project's contractor was attentive to the need to clean up the tubing, but that a lot of it got lost in the water due to deep channel conditions and traffic in the harbor. Cleanup efforts are ongoing, according to Army Corps Marine ecologist Todd Randall, who told the Cape Cod Times that the agency was exploring ways to prevent something like this from happening in the future. He said that there were several ideas being considered, including contract requirements for cleanup, as well as better ways to contain materials during underwater projects. Number 5. Sacrificed animals. On 5 separate occasions throughout 2021, police found headless birds on the beach on Tybee Island in the state of Georgia. The most recent discovery happened in October. Just weeks earlier, a visitor to the island stumbled upon 2 decapitated roosters along with 6 plastic cups with dried blood in them. Lieutenant Emery Randolph told local station WSB-TV that the evidence appeared to be ritualistic in nature, but he didn't know whether the birds were beheaded by members of an organized religion or in some other context. He further added that animal sacrifices are legal under federal law when it comes to religion. But even if the practice isn't against the law, locals and tourists alike were put off by the disturbing discoveries. Savannah resident Jennifer Hoffman said that she would prefer if people performed their animal sacrifices on their church grounds. Her husband Brooks echoed the sentiment, stating that he doesn't want it happening on a public beach. Tybee Island police said that the evidence of animal sacrifices have been appearing on the beach for several years now, and that they continue to investigate any reports that come in. What would you do if you stumbled across something like this on the beach? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Number 4. Massive amounts of drugs. During a stroll along the shore near Florida's Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge in late February, a beachgoer spotted a 35-gallon garbage bag filled with what appeared to be a large amount of drugs. Deputies from the Indian River County Sheriff's Office worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to retrieve the bag, which they found wrapped in burlap. They determined its contents to be a 45-pound heroin shipment that had apparently failed to reach its destination. Officials turned the evidence over to the U.S. Border Patrol for further investigation. Sheriff's Deputy Ron Adamson explained that the heroin's packaging was not meant to be waterproof. Instead, he said, a drug runner likely threw it overboard for some reason, or the vessel transporting it took on water. But there had been no recent reports of boat emergencies, making the latter possibility unlikely. It's not entirely unusual for drug smugglers to ditch their product if they believe they've been detected by the Coast Guard or to lose it for some other reason. But it's also not an everyday thing for someone to find such a huge quantity of drugs sitting on a beach. Number 3. Bizarre fish. Eric High was walking along Revere Beach in Massachusetts recently when he spotted a huge 5-foot-long fish washed up on the beach completely out of the water. He noticed that it was moving its gills and realized it was still alive. High described the fish as having a strange snout and looking like a dinosaur. It also had a rope around its tail. High dragged the creature back into the water, but noticed that it was still unwell. He posted photos on social media in the hopes that someone could help identify the species. Experts speculated that it was an Atlantic sturgeon. The ancient species typically grows between 6 and 9 feet long, but can reach up to 13 feet. High's description of the fish as dinosaur-like is actually somewhat fitting, since sturgeons have been around since the time of the dinosaurs. But the critically endangered species' 200-million-year existence may soon come to an end as it struggles to survive the effects of human activity. Unfortunately, the fish that High found died. Wildlife officials tried to save it, but they were unsuccessful. The rope on the end of its tail suggests that someone had caught the fish and was handling it in an illegal way. At the time the discovery was announced, experts said that they were in the process of retrieving its remains so that they could study it and learn more about how it died. Number 2. Toxic tar balls. The pristine Mediterranean coastline that Israel is famous for became littered with dozens of tons of thick clumps of tar in early 2021. Authorities determined that the globules came from a ship that was leaking oil, posing a serious environmental hazard and a major threat to humans and wildlife. The source of the pollution was a mystery. Civilians were told to avoid a 120-mile stretch of coastline as investigators worked to get to the bottom of the situation and clean up the mess, which left birds and turtles covered in oil. An autopsy on a 55-foot-long fin whale that was found dead on a beach in the country's southern region revealed oil inside the animal's body. Israel's Nature and Parks Authority described the ordeal as one of the most serious ecological disasters in the country's history. Shortly after the toxic blobs appeared, Environmental Protection Minister Gila Gamliel reassured the public that officials were working to identify the vessel responsible for the spill. They believed that the spill occurred due to a recent storm and were investigating 9 ships that were in the region at the time. The Israeli government also stated that it was considering pursuing legal action against the offender. Things became heated as theories and allegations spread. Gamliel implied that whoever was responsible had acted maliciously, in other words, with bad intent or out of neglect. Many suspected that an illegal vessel was most likely the culprit. At one point, a Greek tanker called the Minerva Helen was accused of causing the disaster. The ship's owner adamantly denied being involved, but Israeli authorities carried out a raid just to be sure. They found no evidence that the vessel had any connections to the spill and ruled out numerous other ships that had fallen under their suspicion. Number 1. Dead cow. Residents in Hancock County, Mississippi were shocked to discover a dead cow washed up in the Gulf Coast on Waveland last year. They awoke to find the lifeless animal on a beach near the Silver Slipper Casino. Local station WLOX spoke with county officials who said that there were several nearby properties owned by livestock owners and that their animals tend to escape frequently. But they were unsure of where the dead cow came from. The remains were removed from the scene using a front loader and a dump truck and taken to an area where large animals are often buried. An equally perplexing situation happened in 2016 when 2 goats, a hog, and around 6 chickens were found along a beach in Biloxi, Mississippi. There were no signs of abuse, leading authorities to believe that the animals had died during severe flooding in neighboring Louisiana and floated over to the Biloxi shoreline via the Gulf of Mexico.
Number 10. German U-boat UB-122. For over a century now, a remarkably intact submarine has sat in the mud along the bank of the River Medway in Kent, England. It is thought to be one of more than 100 U-boats that the Germans surrendered at the end of World War I. Some of the vessels were given to the French Navy, but most were simply scrapped. Nobody knows how or why the lone wrecked submarine ended up where it is. Experts believe it's a U-boat known as UB-122, which was among the surrendered group of vehicles. It would have carried as many as 10 torpedoes during the war. It's possible that the tow line pulling the boat snapped and broke off, and it was more trouble than it was worth to chase the submarine down. UB-122 is the only complete U-boat that has ever been found in British tidal waters, according to marine archaeologist Mark Dunkley, who spoke with Mail Online. He said that there are no plans to preserve it. This is the only visible example of just 40 known U-boat wrecks that happened in British waters. The vehicle's visibility changes along with the water levels, and it's gained an increasing amount of attention in recent years after being exposed by a series of harsh storms. Number 9. SS City of Adelaide. Launched from Glasgow, Scotland in 1863, the SS City of Adelaide originally served as a passenger steamship that carried passengers between Sydney, Melbourne, and Honolulu. It was later converted into a cargo vessel and sailed for nearly 50 years before it was gutted by a days-long fire in 1912. George Butler, a resident of Australia's Magnetic Island, bought the burned ship with plans to use it as a breakwater, but it ran aground in Cockle Bay while en route to its new home. During World War II, a bomber struck one of its masts during a training exercise, killing 3 members of the Australian Air Force and 1 member of the US Navy. To this day, the waterlogged vessel remains partially submerged at the crash site. The hull is in pieces after being battered by the elements, and it's become deteriorated and overgrown with mangrove trees that have genetically adapted to survive in the unusual and challenging environment. Because it's located in a marine park, the wreck is protected from commercial fishers, allowing the mangroves to continue growing undisturbed as they take over what's left of the city of Adelaide. Number 8. Prora. It's hard to imagine Adolf Hitler as the type of person who believed in taking vacations, but even he thought that select people deserved some downtime, and his vision for what that looked like was about as bleak as you probably imagine it to be. During the late 1930s, Hitler commissioned the construction of 8 identical buildings along the coast of Germany's Rügen Island. Known as Prora, the resort complex occupied a 3-mile stretch of the shoreline. According to the plans, each room would have a view of the Baltic Sea. Staircases, hallways, and other amenities would be on the land-facing side of the buildings. Each room would have a few beds, a sink, and an armoire, and there would be several shared bathrooms on each floor. The no-frills resort was meant to be efficient and cost-effective, so that average German workers could afford to spend their time off there. Prora was one of several designated vacation sites that the Nazi leisure organization planned through its efforts to provide common people with places to go on holiday. Little did the public know, however, that Hitler also had secret plans to use these properties as fallback military installations if the need ever arose. But the dictator's vision for Prora was never fully realized. Construction ground to a screeching halt when the war began in 1939, leaving the resort and its 10,000 rooms empty and unfinished. The site still found use as housing for refugees and then as an elderly housing complex, but it has sat abandoned and decaying since sometime during the 90s. Number 7. Liepaja Northern Forts. There is a curious collection of long-abandoned, crumbling concrete bunkers dotting Latvia's western coast. Built during the 19th and 20th centuries under Tsarist Russian rule, these decaying structures once surrounded the entire coastal city of Liepaja and were part of its central fortress. According to Latvia's official travel website, the buildings were abandoned in 1908, barely a decade after they were finished being built, after being deemed a strategic mistake. Attempts to demolish the structures with explosives were only partially successful. The ruins that survived the blast remain in place today, but the encroaching Baltic Sea appears to be completing the unfinished demolition work as it takes an ever-present toll on the remaining bunkers. Some of the forts have collapsed and some are still standing, at least for now. Tourists can visit the ruins of the northern forts, as they're called, while they're still there. During guided tours, visitors can step back in time by playing an interactive game called Escape from the USSR. It's more or less a mock scenario that involves rescuing a friend who was kidnapped by the Soviets. Would you be up for a round, or would you rather just learn from a tour guide the old-fashioned way? Let me know in the comments below, but first, be sure to subscribe. Number 6. The Bay of Abandoned Hotels. Along the Adriatic coastline near the Croatian seaside town of Kupari, there's a handful of 5 derelict hotels that have been reclaimed by nature. Nicknamed the Bay of Hotels, they were built during the 1960s when the region was part of Yugoslavia. Altogether, the upscale hotels could accommodate up to 1,600 guests, and there was a nearby campground with room for up to 4,000 people, as well as numerous private villas. The resort was paid for mostly with military funding, and as its popularity grew, it became increasingly difficult for ordinary people to book a room. Soon enough, the property gained a reputation as an exclusive place for the military elite. When Croatia declared independence from Yugoslavia in 1991, things changed drastically throughout the region. During the war that followed, Croatian soldiers took up residence at the hotels. Yugoslavian forces proceeded to destroy the resort that they had built over a several-week period, and burning the hotels in a bid to drive out the Croatians. The war ended in 1995 with a Croatian victory. Today, the region remains littered with reminders of the devastating violence that they went through to win the conflict. Once bustling vacation sites now sit rotting along the otherwise picturesque coastline. But that may soon change. The area has seen an uptick in visitors in recent years, and the decaying hotels are catching the attention of investors and developers, indicating that perhaps the property will be revived at some point in the near future. Number 5. SV Karl. The SV Karl was a steel-hulled German warship that ran aground on the Cornish coast during World War I. Its long-forgotten ruins reappeared in 2019 during low tide after a violent storm. In 1917, the British Navy was towing the 60-foot, 3-masted sailing vessel to London, with plans to dismantle it for scrap metal when it became stuck on a reef during a storm and broke away from its tow line. Tugboats made 2 attempts to refloat the ship after salvage experts noticed that the hull seemed undamaged. But their efforts were in vain, and the SV Karl was ultimately declared a loss and abandoned in place. Shortly thereafter, it became buried in sand. Late last year, the long-buried ship briefly emerged from the sand, giving people an opportunity to catch a glimpse of the ghastly wreck. This isn't the first time that the ship revealed itself to beachgoers, though. It often appears during winter, when storms wash away the sand covering it, according to Cornwall Live. But the vessel is never exposed for long before the sands wash back over it, reconcealing it. The sand has helped to preserve the SV Karl, which is in surprisingly good shape for its age. It is just one of an estimated 6,000 shipwrecks along the 250-mile Cornish coastline. Number 4. Flamenco beach tanks. There's a rather large collection of rusting, graffiti-covered World War II-era tanks dotting the beach along Puerto Rico's Culebra Island. These decaying military vehicles look strangely out of place against the backdrop of white sand in the turquoise Caribbean Sea. The American military began using Culebra Island in 1901, after Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the US at the end of the Spanish-American War. That same year, then-President Theodore Roosevelt gave the public parts of the island to the Navy. No official base was ever established there, but the military nevertheless carried out bombing and other weapons practice on the island for decades. At one point, the military tried to evict the local population from Culebra, but residents fought back by peacefully protesting the Navy's occupation of their home, and they didn't stop until their voices were heard. The military eventually conceded and agreed to leave Culebra Island. By 1975, there were few remaining signs of its former presence. Navy personnel removed the smaller pieces of equipment that had been left behind, but the tanks are still there today, dotting the shoreline as they rot in the salty sea breeze. Number 3. Douglas DC-3. If you walk along Iceland's Solheimasandur beach, you'll see the remains of a deteriorating World War II-era Douglas DC-3 military plane. It has sat rusting in the volcanic black sand ever since it crashed there in 1973 for reasons that remain unknown to this day. Everyone survived when the aircraft went down while being flown by US Navy pilots, but nobody could explain exactly what happened. Investigators suspected that an empty fuel tank could be the culprit, and that the pilot might have tried to access the tank before the crew realized that their only choice was to make an emergency landing. The wreck was simply left at the crash site, where it remains today. A significant portion of the fuselage is gone, the wings are gone, and only half the tail is still there. The aircraft is in surprisingly good shape despite being extensively damaged, especially after sitting on the beach for nearly 50 years, where conditions are known to be harsh. According to local legend, a farmer removed and sold the tail's missing portion, but that rumor has never been proven or disproven. Number 2. Lun Ekranoplan. Nicknamed the Caspian Sea Monster, the Lun-class Ekranoplan was a ground-effect vehicle, which means that it flew close to the ground or water while its wings generated lift and reduced aerodynamic drag. The only vehicle that was ever completed, known as the MD-160, was designed in 1975 and served under the Soviet and Russian navies from 1987 until sometime during the late 90s. It glided along just 13 feet above the water surface at a maximum cruising speed of around 340 miles per hour. The aircraft carried 6 missile launchers arranged in pairs of 2 and was equipped for anti-surface warfare. Because it had no chassis, the Ekranoplan was unable to travel on shore. Instead, it was stored on a floating dry dock that was built specifically for it. The dock was towed out into the bay and sunk into the water, leaving the plane floating and ready ready to power up and go. Capable of remaining self-sufficient for up to 5 days, the Akranoplan was the world's heaviest aircraft when it was in service. Today, the only completed vehicle sits on a beach along the Caspian Sea in Derbent, Russia, where it's been since 2020. Number 1. SS Paulo Alto. The SS Paulo Alto is one of several ships that were built toward the end of World War I with a combination of concrete and steel. Known as ferroconcrete, the material was much cheaper than the cost of building a ship entirely out of steel. The Paulo Alto was designed as a tanker for the US Navy, but the war was long over by the time it was finished being built in 1919. For the next 10 years, the ship was mothballed, which means that it was stored in case a later need arose for its use. But the military eventually decided to get rid of it, and in 1929, the Seacliff Amusement Corporation bought the vessel and grounded it off the Northern California coast, with plans to turn it into an entertainment complex featuring a dance pool, cafe, swimming pool, and more. But the stock market crashed later that year, devastating the economy and causing unforeseen financial problems for the ship's owners. Within a few years, the company went bankrupt. The Paulo Alto's future became even bleaker when it cracked during a brutal winter storm. But not all hope was lost. The state of California bought the ship and turned it into a fishing pier for a short time. Bad weather continued to batter the Paulo Alto, however, rendering the pier unsafe and leading to its closure in 1950. The site was reopened in the 1980s for several years, following a short-lived restoration attempt. In the early 2000s, dozens of seabirds died from exposure to oil that was eventually traced to the ship's fuel tank, which was cracked and leaking. The pollution wreaked havoc on the environment, killing hundreds of birds and harbor seals and leading to a $1.7 million cleanup effort. The Paulo Alto was reopened yet again in 2016 for a brief period, but the vessel ultimately lost its decades-long battle against Mother Nature, and it remains closed to the public to this day. In 2017, record-breaking 34-foot storm waves broke the ship in half. It now sits in 4 pieces, and any hope of restoring it has been lost. Number 10. Military machines. Even the most remote parts of the globe are home to spectacular war machines. Dmitry Osadji is a photographer and history enthusiast who spent 5 years traveling to more than 50 countries on his quest to capture these historic vehicles on film before they rust away and disappear. He's photographed old military equipment in almost every type of environment imaginable, including the desert of the United Arab Emirates, where he took some snapshots of decaying planes, as well as the Russian Arctic, where he encountered ships that were trapped in ice. The 38-year-old photographer has snapped pictures of the Lund-class Akranoplan, a 301-foot-long Soviet aircraft nicknamed the Caspian Sea Monster. Developed in 1975 for the Soviet Union, the plane was designed to fly just over the water at extremely low altitudes. It's been sitting on the beach in Derbent, Russia since 2020. Osadji also snapped haunting images of an entire tank graveyard that's being reclaimed by nature, as well as some Soviet locomotives in Leningrad Oblast and an abandoned torpedo launcher in Kronstadt. Osadji's photos show machines that look like they're ready and waiting to go into battle at any moment, despite obvious signs of wear and tear from decades of sitting there unused. Even though they'll probably never be used again, many of the boats, planes, and tanks are kept in closely guarded places that are closed to the public. Number 9. American Locomotive Graveyard. It would be an understatement to say that the employees at the United States Steel Corporation's plant in Youngstown, Ohio, were upset when they learned that their workplace was shutting down as part of the company's cost-saving efforts. The disappointing news came all the way back in 1979, as the deindustrialization era gripped Middle America, causing huge population declines and widespread economic despair.
Workers at US Steel told the New York Times that they felt betrayed after working so hard to keep the plant in business, but the facility nevertheless closed. The building's use has been largely kept under wraps ever since, and a collection of railroad tracks outside have become a train graveyard over the years. Photos of the dozens of partially disassembled and aging cars were featured on abandoned.net. According to the website, the locomotives are owned by a company called LetX Rail. The graveyard consists of first and second generation cars from Amtrak, Union Pacific, Canadian National, Conrail, and other rail companies. LetX has a nearby warehouse filled with thousands of train parts, as well as around 400 locomotives that are ready for use at any time. This part of the property also once belonged to US Steel, but has since found new purpose in another one of America's most historic industries. Number 8. USS Ariscan. The United States has more aircraft carriers than any other country on Earth. One of them was the USS Ariscan. It was built for the US Navy and entered service right after World War II. From then until the 1970s, the vessel operated primarily in the Pacific. It served in the Korean War and in Vietnam, and received 12 battle stars between both conflicts. In 1966, someone accidentally lit a magnesium flare aboard the Ariscan. A catastrophic fire broke out, tragically killing 47 service members. The ship was taken out of service in 1976. It was sold as scrap in 1995, but the buyer didn't do anything with it, and it was repossessed 2 years later. During that time, the Ariscan bounced between various shipyards in California and Texas. The Navy came up with a creative way to repurpose it as an artificial reef by sinking it off the Florida coast. In late 2004, the vessel was towed to Pensacola, where scientists performed tests to ensure that it would pose no dangers to marine life or the environment after being relocated to the ocean floor. Finally, in 2006, a Navy team sank the Ariscan in the Gulf of Mexico. After spending years aimlessly traveling from one shipyard and the next, the dilapidated vessel finally found its forever home as one of the world's most popular diving sites, now known as the Carrier Reef. Number 7. New River Scenic Railway Train. From 2008 to 2010, the New River Scenic Railway took tourists on a 62-mile journey through eastern Tennessee. The train ride was born from the idea of a pair of innovators from the region who wanted to start a tourism business. They negotiated with a coal company that owned the tracks for access to the line and bought a locomotive out of Arizona for their train, along with a passenger car and a baggage car that was converted into a snack and gift stand. The scenic rides quickly became popular. Soon enough, the owners had to add another passenger car to the train to keep up with the demand. But after operating for just 2 years, the line fell under new ownership and it interfered with the ability to run the business. The train was parked at the end of its former line and has sat there ever since, nestled among the trees. For a while, the owners tried to take care of it, but it became too much to keep up with. According to train enthusiast John David Ezell, who spoke with local station WBIR, he further explained that whenever someone went to fix or maintain something on the train, something else went wrong. Eventually, they gave up on it. The train is heavily rusting and deteriorating, with missing and broken windows, ripped upholstery, and a sun-bleached interior. It looks like it's been sitting there for far longer than it has, and is a saddening reminder of a thriving company that, unlike many involved in the rail business, did not shut down due to a lack of business. Would you like to see this train in person? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 6. USS Saum. The USS Saum was built in 1902 for a wealthy businessman, but the yacht ended up spending the majority of its life serving in 2 major wars. It first saw combat during World War I, when the US military started renting boats from rich owners and using them to stop enemy submarines from interfering with British and American supply lines. During the conflict, the Navy acquired the 186-foot-long Saum and converted it into a military ship. It was equipped with machine guns, but this wasn't enough to fend off the Germans. The military solved the problem by letting Thomas Edison use the vessel for submarine combat experiments. When the war ended, the Navy returned the yacht to its owner, but it quickly changed hands again and became a fishing vessel for a short time before duty called once again during World War II. The Navy rented the Sachem after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This time, it was named the USS Fennikite. Just like the First World War, the boat's job was to spot German U-boats. Between both wars, it earned an American Campaign Medal and 2 Victory Medals. The decorated vessel returned to civilian life after World War II. A New York City-based cruise company bought it and repurposed it as a recreational boat, during which time it was renamed the Sightseer, then the Circle Line 5. During the late 80s, the yacht was featured in Madonna's Papa Don't Preach music video. But its glory days ended shortly thereafter, when it was anchored along an Ohio River tributary near its owner's property in Petersburg, Kentucky. It then fell into disrepair. The Sachem hasn't moved since. Locals simply refer to it as the ghost ship. Its name is still visible on the rusting hull, at least for now. Seeing the yacht in its current state makes it difficult to imagine it as a proud military vessel or a luxury cruise liner. Number 5. Red Star Graveyard. During the early 20th century, the Hungarian railway network built the Red Star train yard, also known as the István Telek train yard, outside the city of Budapest. It was designed for performing maintenance and repairs on the country's rapidly expanding rail fleet. Soon enough, diesel engines began replacing locomotives, and the site ended up doubling as a scrapyard. Outdated equipment began to pile up on the property, and much of it remains there to this day. There are over 100 locomotives and cars at the train yard. Some are equipped with extremely rare engines. Others were reportedly used for transporting World War II prisoners to Auschwitz during the Nazi occupation of Hungary. There are also numerous Soviet-era trains. Only a few parts of the train yard are still actively being used today. Most of it is abandoned and has been largely forgotten, despite the train car's connections to significant historical events. Many believe that these pieces of equipment are worth preserving. Some of the neglected cars and locomotives were supposed to be relocated to a local museum. Sadly, this never happened, and the museum eventually closed. And due to a lack of funding, it seems unlikely that the vehicles will ever be restored. We can only hope that a generous donor comes along and decides to save these historic pieces from a certain doom. Number 4. Minsk. The Soviet aircraft carrier Minsk served in the Soviet Navy starting in 1975. It was decommissioned in 1994 after getting into a serious accident that the authorities remain suspiciously quiet about to this day. A Korea-based company bought the Minsk with plans to scrap it, but environmental protesters stopped the plan from following through, and it was instead towed to China. A group of videogame arcade owners fought to save the ship and ultimately ended up buying it for $4.3 million. But things took a bizarre turn in 2000 when the ship was repurposed as a military theme park called Minsk World. It changed hands several times over the following years before ending up in the ownership of a Chinese real estate company. Minsk World closed in 2016, and its new owners announced that it was being towed to a location near Shanghai for renovations. But that never happened, and the Minsk has been wasting away in the same spot for several years now. Drone footage revealed that the ship is in very poor condition, and it's clear that no work has been done on it, leaving some to wonder if the project was delayed or abandoned altogether. For now, the vessel's future remains uncertain. Number 3. Aircraft Graveyard in Hungary. Near the tiny Hungarian town of Nagyamot, there's a small aircraft graveyard containing an abandoned runway and over 30 military planes from bygone eras. Located close to the modern-day Papa military base, the deserted property was built during the 1930s as an air base. The Soviet Union took control of the site in 1945. It remained in operation until all of its planes were decommissioned in 1997. Some of the aircraft were sold to museums and collectors, but others found a permanent home at the abandoned base. Their tanks were filled with cement to prevent anyone from trying to fly them. All remaining military personnel left the site in 2001. The former base is home to 5 Sukhoi Su-22 fighter jets and 29 Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-21s. Developed by the Soviet Union, these aircraft are known for their effective fighting capabilities. In fact, many countries have relied on these models since they were first introduced during the 1960s. The jets were especially popular among the Eastern Bloc countries, with the Hungarian military employing more than 250 MiG-21s at one point. Sadly, the planes at the abandoned property are sinking into the mud from the weight of the concrete they are filled with. Even worse, scavengers are dismantling the historic, decaying vehicles piece by piece over time. Number 2. Kimasu. Nicknamed Le Clem, the Kimasu was one of the French Navy's largest aircraft carriers, and the 6th vessel of its type ever built for the country. The ship's lengthy 40-plus-year career began in 1961 with a handful of peacekeeping and military missions. She traveled more than 1 million nautical miles throughout her lifetime. To give you an idea of how far that is, it's the equivalent of circumnavigating the globe 48 times. But like all ships, Kimasu's time to retire eventually came, and she was finally decommissioned in 1997. She was towed to India to be scrapped in 2005, but met backlash from environmental protesters who argued that the country lacked the resources to properly dispose of the ship. India's Supreme Court sided with the activists and banned the vessel from being scrapped there due to its potential to cause pollution. Over the next several years, Kimasu changed hands numerous times and traveled to different countries under its various owners. It was finally dismantled in 2010 at a decommissioning facility in the UK. Number 1. Sturmovik. The Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik is a World War II-era Soviet-manufactured ground attack aircraft. Over 36,000 were made between 1941 and 1946, making it the most heavily produced military aircraft in aviation history. Yet only a dozen or so complete examples of the plane exist today. In 2017, Russian researchers recovered a rare single-seater Sturmovik from Lake Kryvyi in Murmansk Oblast. Not surprisingly, the plane was extremely rusted and decaying, but for an aircraft that crash-landed and then sat in 60 feet of water for 75 years, it was in remarkably good condition. The team was able to make out its serial number and Red Army insignia, and they found propaganda papers and maps inside the cockpit. It appears as though the Sturmovik was struck by German troops, leaving the pilot with no choice but to perform a forced landing. He managed to travel back into friendly territory before ditching in the lake. Thankfully, he escaped alive. Shortly after the plane's discovery, news articles reported that it's being restored to airworthy status. It'll be the first single-seat Sturmovik that's capable of taking to the skies in modern times. Thanks for watching. Which of these abandoned vehicles did you find most interesting and why? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye!